want to recognize the Secretary General for the Ministry of Trade, the senior officials that are here this afternoon, my colleague, Ambassador from UEMWA. It really is a pleasure and an honor for me to be here with you this afternoon. The private sector will have to forgive me. They had their chance in the morning. I will now focus on the students in the room and talk to them directly. It is really important to engage with students and universities, because it is students who are at the heart of societal critiquing, who generate ideas, who generate knowledge, and who are able to advance societies and move societies forward. So it is important that we engage with students and the youth in general on the African continent. Since I was elected by the Assembly in 2020, I think I have, even with COVID, I have visited and spoken at 6 or 7 universities. Because I believe that we have to engage with the young people of the continent, and that is those of us who are privileged and honored to be leaders in the continent. We have a responsibility, a particular responsibility, to subject ourselves to accountability. Accountability of what we are doing and why we're doing it, so that if you think I'm doing something wrong that I should not be doing, you tell President Macky Sall in the next election, we want this guy out. We want someone who will subject themselves to the will of the people. And so it's very important that we are here for this conversation. As I did this morning, let me once again express condolences to the people and the government of the Republic of Senegal for the tragic events of last week. We were in Malabo for the summit of heads of states when President Sall had to leave to attend to the tragedy that happened. But you should rest assured that the entire family of the African Union was with you on that day in thought. Trade agreements are not about the past. Trade agreements are about the future. That's why it's important to engage with the future of the continent. The UN tells us that by the year 2050, Africa will have the largest population of young people, that is to say below the age of 35, will be here on this continent. So we have got to do what one of my heroes, President Thomas Isidore Sankara, always said, that is, we must invent the future today, so that those young people who come can find a better African continent than we did. That is what ZLECAf is about. It is about capturing the future of the continent. We have to admit, of course, the history of our continent, the economic trajectory of our continent, and that since independence, we've made progress in some respects, but at the same time, there have been reversals of the progress, the modest progress that we made. We saw strong performance in Africa in the early 60s, up to the 1970s. And at that time, growth rates in Africa were very similar to the so-called Asian tigers. And we saw this positive progression right up until 2000, 2001, from 1975 onwards. But we then saw a sharp deterioration in Africa's economic outlook. We saw many cynics referring to our continent as an economic basket case. And then from the year 2005 to date, right up until the onset of the pandemic, we were referred to as the continent on the rise. But we must not forget that actually the characterization of our continent that had always appeared as if it is predominant is that of disease, violence, wars, military coups d'etats, and of course underdevelopment. So where does ZLECAf fit into this characterization? And why should we think that ZLECAf is a tool for the advancement of our continent? Why should we hold that particular view? Since the end of colonialism, the defeat of colonialism on the continent, we have been characterized, in addition to what I've just said, by smallness of national economies, lack of competitiveness, lack of industrial capacity and depth, and of course, the continued reliance on the export of primary commodities to countries of the north. And this has trapped us in what I refer to as a colonial economic model. Go to any country in Africa, most countries in Africa, the infrastructure that was left behind by colonialists was an infrastructure that extracts from the raw materials from the mines, use the infrastructure to the port to take the raw materials from Africa to Europe mainly. This is the legacy of colonialism that we inherited. This is the legacy, an economic colonial model that we have to dismantle using ZLECAf as a tool. Today, intra-Africa trade is at 18% at best. We trade more with Europe than we trade amongst one another as African countries. We are better connected with Europe than we are connected in terms of infrastructure, than we are connected as African countries. And this is across the continent. English-speaking Africa, French-speaking Africa, Portuguese-speaking Africa, Spanish-speaking Africa, all of us. We have a trade pattern and a trade network that takes us elsewhere, that takes the African continent to be subservient to the global economy by continuing to provide these minerals and natural resources to the rest of the world, unprocessed, leading to the condition that we are in today. If you compare intra-Africa trade, which is at 18%, with intra-European trade, over 70%, intra-North America trade, over 50%, intra-South Asia trade, over 35%. Trade in Africa is at the far end from a regional trading perspective. And so we have a monumental task of reversing this pattern of colonialism. We stand, as I mentioned before, we stand on the shoulders of the founding mothers and fathers of the Organization of African Unity. And a single objective, of course, was to push back the frontiers of colonialism defeat colonialism in Africa, and integrate our continent from a political perspective. I would argue that with the defeat of apartheid in my country, in South Africa, in 1994, that to an extent, the founding mothers and fathers of the Organization of African Unity did achieve the objective of liberating our continent from colonialism. However, what has continued to evade our continent is economic integration. And what I've described, the trade patterns that exist today, underscore the fact that economic integration has evaded us for the last 60 to 65 years. And so as we stand on the shoulders of these great giants of African liberation, we have a particular responsibility to complete their work and to carry on from where they left off. And that is the integration of our continent. Part of the reason why the Assembly of Heads of States and Government of the African Union has been driving the implementation, the negotiations of the AFCFTA is to complete this task of economic integration in Africa, but also to place Africa on a different trajectory, economically speaking, and also from the point of view of industrial development. If you were there this morning, forgive me for repeating what I said in the morning. We have to accelerate the industrial development of our continent in order to be globally competitive. If you look at the two crises that are happening today in the world, the war in Ukraine, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. One is a public health crisis, the other one is a geopolitical crisis. But both of these crises have underscored Africa's weakness, and that is lack of productive capacity and a shallow industrial base. When the pandemic started in the year 2020, Africa suffered. We did not have access to masks, germ-killing products. Of course, we did not have initially vaccines on the continent. When global supply chains were disrupted, that caused food insecurity in Africa. It also caused global commodities markets to be subdued, and those of us African countries who rely on the export of primary commodities suffered as a result of the pandemic and its initial onset in 2020. The second crisis has a similar effect on us as a continent. The conflict in Ukraine. We have seen a 20% rise or 27% increase in the cost of wheat and other cereals that we import from Ukraine and Russia. An over-reliance on the import of wheat, cereals, barley from Ukraine and Russia. So clearly, when you look at these recent events, you don't require a more compelling reason for Africa to accelerate implementation of ZLECAf, for Africa to accelerate industrial development and ensure self-sufficiency, as well as the establishment of regional value chains, so that in future, where global supply chains are disrupted, we as a continent can still be self-sufficient through our own regional supply chains. This morning I mentioned the example, again to illustrate this point of the need for industrial development, acceleration, and value addition on the continent. I mentioned the coffee industry. We export $6 billion worth of coffee in 2015. $100 billion industry globally is the coffee industry. You can see along the value chain the loss for the African continent. The repackaging is done elsewhere. Processing is done elsewhere, leading to a $100 billion industry. Similarly, in the area of pharmaceuticals, we imported $16 billion worth of pharmaceutical products, mainly generic drugs, in the year 2019. That means that we are exporting $16 billion worth of jobs, innovation, creativity, investment. That is what that $16 billion imports of pharmaceuticals, that's what it means in reality for our continent. And so we have to do more. We have to do more to make sure that we contribute more than just the 2% to global trade and output that all of us combined currently contribute. And the only way we can do that is through accelerated industrialization on our continent. Now, when we characterize the state of our continent for the last 60 years, 65 years or so, we are not placing blame on anybody. We are simply taking the step of correcting what we need to correct in order for our continent to be globally competitive. And so ZLECAf is a tool for us to reverse this historical anomaly that I mentioned, where most of the trade in our continent is with the rest of the world. And as I said earlier, it involves primarily raw materials, extractive materials, which are processed elsewhere. Now, in order for us to put our conversation in perspective, let me start by reminding ourselves of the primary purpose of ZLECAf. Apart from the political economy objectives, it is industrialization and to connect our economies through infrastructure and to enable competitiveness in the African continent. And so the rules that you will see when you pick up the agreement, the legal text of ZLECAf, those rules are aimed at reducing and eliminating barriers to intra-Africa trade, intra-Africa investment in a range of different areas: competition policy, intellectual property rights, dispute settlement, sanitary and phytosanitary standards, digital trade, and others. Trade plays a very significant role in the growth and development of countries through its linkages with all sectors of the economy. And that is exactly why we have a comprehensive trade agreement that includes digital trade, intellectual property rights, amongst other areas of our continent's economy. We know from the example of other countries around the world that trade, and particularly intra-regional trade, that it does lead to higher living standards, and that it does lift millions and millions of people out of poverty. Export-led industrialization and export-led development in China lifted millions and millions of Chinese people out of extreme poverty in less than one generation. Whether we are looking at Indonesia, Brazil, Australia, or even Europe as the most recent example, trade does provide a path to accelerated growth, prosperity, and job creation. And as you may recall, history has unfolded along the routes of global trade from Timbuktu to the Silk Road, which is a series of trade routes between Europe and Asia. Africa should be no exception. There's no reason to suggest that where we implement this agreement aggressively, where we ensure regional integration of our markets, our infrastructure, there is no reason to suggest that Africa will not see higher levels of standards of living, as well as increased intra-regional trade. In the year 2063, when we will be aiming and looking at the achievements of the African Union's Agenda 2063, the question that we should ask at that time is, what did ZLECAf do to deliver the Africa that we want? As you may be aware, Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, ZLECAf is embedded in it as one of the flagship projects of the African continent. In Agenda 2063, we emphasize Africa's industrialization and modernization through ZLECAf. That is why in Article 3 of ZLECAf, we specifically mention the need to promote industrial development through diversification and regional value chains development, agricultural development, and ensuring food security. We also emphasize in ZLECAf the importance of the services sector, particularly the services sectors that employ mainly young people and women. These are sectors that include tourism and value-added agricultural services. Africa has a market of 1.3 billion people with a combined GDP of 3.4 trillion United States dollars. And this GDP is projected to increase by the year 2035. Africa's GDP, combined GDP, is projected to increase to almost 7 trillion United States dollars. That is to say, consumer spending as well as business spending. It is therefore a significant market that presents itself for investment as well as foreign direct investment. Through ZLECAf, we are positioning this continent of 1.3 billion people to be a very attractive investment destination, to see the gains of investment by those who invest in the manufacturing sector and those who invest in infrastructure, to see the benefits of their investments leveraging on a market of 1.3 billion people. With the full implementation of ZLECAf, I believe that our continent has a potential to grow even faster. You will recall that before the onset of the pandemic, in 2019, of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world, 6 were in Africa. Senegal was one of them. However, as we all know, the impact of the pandemic caused many countries in sub-Saharan Africa to go into a technical recession. But for the COVID-19 pandemic, I believe that the African continent would be well on the way to even higher growth rates than we have seen. At that time, in 2019, our continent was growing by about 3.5% per annum. Of course, as I've just mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic slowed us down. But through aggressive implementation of ZLECAf, we have an opportunity to yet again place our continent on a path for growth. UNECA predicts that by the year 2040, implementation of ZLECAf will increase intra-Africa trade by 15 to 25%, or 50 to 70 billion dollars. Similarly, the World Bank projects that when we implement ZLECAf, we stand to increase the volume of intra-Africa trade by 81% by the year 2035, and grow the volume of total African exports by 29%. The IMF also projects welfare gains of about 2 to 4%, mainly from the reduction of non-tariff barriers under ZLECAf. Therefore, ZLECAf makes Africa a larger and a more attractive market to invest in, makes our market too big to ignore. The combined market size, the growing youth population that I referred to earlier, the vast minerals that we have in our continent, position our continent for potentially sustained global competitiveness over the next decades. Where are the priorities as we implement ZLECAf? First, I would say that the inclusion of the private sector is critical. This agreement was not negotiated for governments. Governments do not trade. Governments do not export. It is the private sector that exports. It is small medium enterprises that export. It is young entrepreneurs who add dynamism to any country or region's economy. And so the private sector has to be at the center of implementation of ZLECAf. Indeed, if Africa is to be the next global growth point, the private sector must be at the forefront of implementation of ZLECAf. We therefore have to strengthen our engagement and have a structured engagement with the private sector so that we see the benefits of the private sector fully participating in the implementation of ZLECAf. The continent has an abundance of natural resources that can be transformed into higher end products, so that the value chain that we talk about is a value chain not of primary commodities, but a value chain of value-added production, and we're beginning to see this. I mentioned in the morning an example of the DRC and Zambia taking a very bold decision that they will no longer export some of the raw primary commodities, that they will do value addition in the DRC and in Zambia, particularly of copper and products that are required to make lithium batteries for electric vehicles. You can imagine what will happen in the next 20 to 30 years, or maybe even sooner, with the transformation of the global automotive sector from combustible engines to electric vehicles. You can imagine where our continent will be positioned when we focus on the production of lithium batteries for electric vehicles. This is the value-added production and the industrialization that ZLECAf is all about, as well as the establishment of regional value chains in a number of very important sectors. In order to achieve this, or to make a contribution to Africa's industrialization, the AFCFTA Secretariat has identified a number of priority value chains: agriculture and agro-processing, the automotive sector, pharmaceuticals, transport and logistics. I mentioned the example of pharmaceuticals and the export capacity of Africa in the area of pharmaceuticals. I want to give you an example in the automotive sector of the export capacity of Africa and why we need to mobilize the private sector to ensure that we see industrialization and job creation in these 4 priority sectors that I've mentioned. Africa has a population, 17% of the global population is in Africa. We in Africa manufacture less than 1 million vehicles per year. India, a country that is similarly situated in terms of population to Africa, manufactures close to 5 million vehicles per year. That means that in the automotive sector, Africa has an opportunity to produce up to 4 million vehicles per year in order to reach global competitiveness. The automotive sector comprises, along the value chains, agricultural products, over 30,000 products, over 30,000 components make up a vehicle. Whether it is rubber or leather, copper, there are various inputs that are required to make a vehicle. And so when we focus our industrialization efforts in these priority value chains, we believe that we can contribute up to $11 billion in production annually, $11 billion in productive capacity, and $5 billion in intra-African trade, creating over 700,000 jobs. I also mentioned this morning that the automotive sector, based on their experience of countries such as Germany, is potentially a very strong driver of a region or a country's industrialization. And more importantly, the automotive sector creates jobs, decent paying jobs, particularly for young people. We will not be able to achieve this projection of $11 billion annually as a continent if we do not work with the private sector. If we do not work with our development finance institutions to ensure that we mobilize the investment that is required to broaden participation of countries in these value chains that I have mentioned. I'm very happy to inform you that for the automotive sector, we have mobilized already we have mobilized $1 billion to enable those countries who want to invest in the automotive sector and become part of that value chain and contribute to Africa's industrialization, that those countries, as we speak, all of ZLECAf countries, will now have access to this facility. In the area of textiles and clothing, we are mobilizing about $550 million to ensure that, once again, Africa does become competitive. It is not a pipe dream to say that our continent will one day be globally competitive. I want to give you an example of what I'm talking about. Today, Lesotho, through their industrialization action plan that they've implemented over the last 10 to 20 years, supplies the US company, and that Lesotho would supply such a sophisticated consumer market as the United States, would be one of the top suppliers of garments in the United States. So you can imagine what we can do as the African continent, where we combine our efforts and we integrate our market into a single market. All of us potentially can be a Lesotho from the perspective of global competitiveness. And I believe that with all my heart. And so I am inspired by the example of Lesotho that I have just mentioned, that actually we can be globally competitive as a continent and as individual countries where we are driven by a vision. And in this case, the vision is ZLECAf and its implementation. The second priority is for us to enable efficient, cost-effective, affordable access to trade. Today, if here in Senegal you want to trade with somebody in Kenya, you first have to convert the CFA franc into the dollar or the euro. You then transact with your counterparty in Kenya. Your counterparty will receive the United States dollar. Then they will have to convert the dollar to the shilling. the cost of currency convertibility, we estimate it to be about $5 billion annually. And so as we transact around the continent, as we trade around the continent, region to region, country to country, trying to overcome this challenge of 42 currencies, the cost to Africa's economy is $5 billion annually. This is what we can quantify. We are not able to quantify the losses to Africa's economy in terms of competitiveness, efficiency, and access to trade. That we cannot quantify. We can estimate that the fact that for us to trade in Africa, we have to use a third currency. And the fact that even when you do use that third currency, it is rooted somewhere else, in another part of the world. Your money gets taken to another part of the world for 2 or 3 days before it reaches your counterpart in Kenya. We can't quantify the loss of competitiveness of our small medium enterprises as a result of this, the fact that we have 42 currencies on the African continent. And so to overcome this particular challenge, we, working with Afreximbank, have introduced what we call the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, which is a digital platform for payments. You will now be able to get on your smartphone, instantaneously transact with your counterparty in Kenya, doing so in local currency. We want to eliminate the reliance on third currencies to trade on the African continent. We believe this partnership with Afreximbank and any other entity that so wishes to participate in this platform, we believe that this is what will contribute to boosting intra-African trade. This is what will contribute to inclusivity by enabling small medium enterprises to be part of Africa's trade trajectory, to enable young entrepreneurs to trade with other young entrepreneurs across the African continent. And so this is a practical tool that is very important for inclusivity of trade in Africa. Trade agreements have been criticized, correctly so in some cases, that they leave behind very important segments of society. That is to say, young entrepreneurs and small medium enterprises that are run by women. That is why what Donald Trump had to say had electoral appeal. If you remember, he said that trade agreements, and NAFTA in particular, is taking jobs away from the United States to Mexico, exporting jobs. And also that trade agreements benefit the wealthy, the elite, and large corporations. So we have a challenge. I hate to admit it, he was right to a certain extent, and I really hate to admit it. A very unsophisticated, he put forward a very unsophisticated analysis, of course. But as we have seen, even as unsophisticated as that analysis is, as we have seen, it has electoral appeal. There has been, in the last 20 years, a rejection of globalization, a rejection of trade agreements, because of this perception of elitism of trade agreements and this perception of lack of inclusivity of trade agreements. And the fact that trade agreements leave behind millions and millions of people. If you look at some countries in Europe, this critique, as unsophisticated as it is, this critique of globalization and trade agreements has given rise to right-wing, fundamentalist, fascist regimes across Europe. Right-wing, fundamentalist, fascist regimes who say, come with us. Let's reject globalization, let's reject trade agreements, come with us. We offer an alternative. And that alternative is nationalism, inward-looking, attempting to disconnect from the global economy and to be inward-looking. This has happened in Europe as a result of this perception of trade agreements. And so we have to, as Africans, ensure, and those of us who serve you have to ensure that the trade agreement that we deliver, that ZLECAf does become an instrument for development and inclusivity. Because where ZLECAf is seen to serve the interests of the corporate elites in Africa exclusively, to serve the interests of the elite, to serve the interests only of governments, or to serve the interests of people like me, bureaucrats, it is not going to succeed. In fact, we will be contributing to a backlash against trade agreements. So we have a unique opportunity here in Africa, and we have already begun to do so, by the way, to demonstrate to the rest of the world that actually you can have a trade agreement that delivers for small medium enterprises and for young people. We now have, as part of the legal architecture of ZLECAf, we have a protocol on women and youth in trade. For the very first time in the implementation and negotiation of trade agreements, for the very first time, here in Africa, we have a protocol on women and youth in trade. So that we move beyond the noble aspirations of inclusivity of women and young people in commerce, and that we codify these aspirations of inclusivity, we codify them into legally binding obligations for all governments to adhere to. For the first time. It has not happened anywhere else in the world. So this is an example of what I mean by having a trade agreement that is inclusive in terms of development. This is the third priority that I am mentioning, inclusivity of small medium enterprises that are led by women as well as young Africans. The other area of importance is digital trade. We know now from the experience of the pandemic that digitization is at the heart of any region or country's economy. In fact, we were on course before the pandemic hit. We were on course to negotiate what we were calling at that time electronic commerce. We then looked at the state of the world and we said, well, actually, it's not adequate to simply say electronic commerce. Let us broaden our ambition and say digital trade in Africa. Because electronic commerce captures only a very, very narrow subset of what happens in the digital economy. And so we are now well on course to ensure that the protocol on digital trade is concluded and is negotiated and concluded, so that we can capture the digital market of Africa, which is expected by the year 2030, the digital trade market in Africa is expected by the year 2030 to be close to $2.5 trillion. We want to make sure that we enable trade in Africa using digital tools. We all know that in 2020 alone, 495 million Africans had access to a mobile phone in sub-Saharan Africa. That is 47% of Africa's population. There are very positive anecdotes of women in Kenya who are farmers of flour, who use their smartphones and digital platforms to access global markets of cut flour. There are other examples where already digital tools enable trade in Africa, and they did so without ZLECAf, before ZLECAf existed. If you think about mobile banking, East Africa had introduced mobile banking before the United States, leading to inclusivity, leading to access to markets, leading to innovation, and growing businesses outside of a particular country to other parts of East Africa, using digital tools, digital-enabled mobile banking. This happened before ZLECAf existed. So you can see the potential where we now have a protocol of digital trade, a protocol that will ensure market access, that will provide a regulatory framework for digital trade, and that will protect consumers who participate in that digital marketplace. I believe that through digital tools, more than transit of physical goods across borders, digital tools will contribute to accelerated intra-Africa trade on the African continent. We have seen this, as I mentioned, in examples across our continent. Let me conclude by saying the following. Such an ambitious agreement, for example, to illustrate the ambition that we have under the leadership of our heads of states, we aim, and it's in the agreement, that by the year 2035, 97%, by the year 2035, 97% of trade in Africa should be at zero duty. Your goods should be able to transit from one country to another zero duty by the year 2035. In the area of trade in services, our ambition is that priority services sectors and other services sectors, such as financial services, distribution services, tourism services, construction services, all of the services sectors that are the backbone of industrial development, that we liberalize trade in these services, including establishing the requisite regulatory frameworks to enable the trade to happen. As we speak today, we have reached convergence on 88.7% rules of origin, which is a remarkable achievement. If you think about it, there are over 5,000 products that are traded around the world, including in Africa. Each country, each region has its own rules of origin, local content requirements. We as Africans have now convergence on over 88% of those globally traded products. Before ZLECAf, we were at zero convergence. In other words, if you wanted to trade between ECOWAS and the East African community, you were trading as if you were trading with Europe. There was no preferential treatment that we granted one another on these products as Africans. we now have reached 88.7% convergence, which is the basis, a very strong basis for us to credibly say that we are trading as Africans on preferential terms. So that your products, when they move to North Africa or Central Africa or Southern Africa, they are treated better than goods that are coming in from a third part of the world. And so the ambition is high. The level of ambition is very, very high, and it has to be because of the 65 years, almost 70 years that I referred to, that we need to catch up on. The World Bank has estimated that when we implement this agreement aggressively, where all of us commit to the rules, such as, for example, dispute settlement. For the first time, we have created a dispute settlement mechanism for the whole of the African continent, where we can now resolve our trade, investment, competition, all disputes that are covered by the agreement, where we can now resolve those disputes using an instrument that we as Africans negotiate, that we as Africans are committed to. That when we implement this agreement, we have a very unique opportunity to lift 100 million Africans out of poverty by the year 2035. 30 million Africans out of abject poverty, 70 million Africans out of moderate poverty by the year 2035. A very positive projection, a very encouraging projection, but it's not going to happen on its own. We as Africans will have to do it. We will have to do it ourselves. We should no longer be the headquarters of poverty in the world. We have to lift ourselves up ourselves. No one is going to do it for us. So the industrial development that I spoke about earlier is a very important part of us as Africans lifting up ourselves. Forgive me for mentioning yet again this example that I mentioned in the morning. And again, I want to mention it for illustrative purposes. The 55 of us contribute 2.1% to global output and global trade. All of us combined. We then have Singapore contributing 6.1% to 6.2%. You can see the differential. And it underscores a number of points. First, it means we have to work hard to improve our industrial capacity, which I believe we can. Second, it means that we have to leverage on the advantages that we already have. A young, large population, mineral resources, so that we can achieve the results that the World Bank projects. What will happen to Africa when we implement this agreement in the way in which we have expressed in our ambition. So, I am very, very optimistic about the future of our continent. And I believe that one day we will be globally competitive. But we won't be globally competitive by chance. We will be globally competitive where we implement the rules of this agreement that enable that productive capacity and industrial capacity. Of course, we have a number of things that we have to work on: free movement of persons, improving infrastructure, connectivity. But I don't believe that we must first solve those problems before we say we're going to march towards industrial development. I don't believe that we must first say, well, let's solve the interconnectivity challenge before we address the issue of integration. I believe that we must confront all of these challenges at the same time. And they are going to be very difficult challenges. It is going to take us a very long time. But I don't think that because it is difficult, I don't believe that because the task is difficult, we should say, well, we give up, let's throw our hands in the air and give up. Because where we take that view that it's too difficult, we shall remain in this condition that we have been in for the last 65 years. We shall remain in the condition that we have been in for the last 65 years if we do not integrate our market so that we can compete globally, create jobs here in Africa, so that our young Africans stop being buried deep in the depths of the Mediterranean. We create jobs for young Africans here at home. So I don't want to leave you with any illusion about how easy it's going to be. But we know that there are positive results because we look at the most successful integration model in history, in economic history, and that is the European Union. I mentioned this morning, if you look at data, where was Poland, the Czech Republic, before they joined the single market? You compare to where they are today, having doubled, tripled GDP per capita, and having become part of the value chain in Europe. There's no reason why it cannot happen here. There's no reason. So I want to thank you very much for listening to what I had to say. I did warn you at the beginning. I did caution you that when I am speaking to intellectuals, I tend to speak for too long. But I'm very happy that we had this dialogue. I look forward to your comments and your questions. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Excellence.